Good afternoon, everyone. It's my profound honor to welcome you to this gathering. Safe, healthy, and resilient homes, structural innovations that build resilience in the face of hurricanes. This topic holds deep personal significance for me. Before coming to Washington, I lived and worked in New Orleans for more than a decade. I was there before and after Katrina, witnessing firsthand how the policy missteps and delayed action can compound challenges families already face. I also witnessed something even more enduring, the extraordinary strength, ingenuity, and resolve of New Orleanians as they fought for the quality of life that everyone deserves. Their courage has stayed with me and continues to shape my view of resilience, not just as a single solution, but as a relentless commitment to building homes, neighborhoods, and communities that can endure and thrive. Today, we gather not just to discuss stronger materials or codes, but to center the people who inhabit these places. Resilience is not merely a technical objective, it is a social and moral imperative. Our goal is to ensure that the benefits of structural innovations reach all residents, particularly those communities that have borne the greatest burdens and, and have had the least access to opportunity. Sustainable, resilient homes must reflect our collective promise of equity, a future where safe, healthy, and durable housing is a standard, not a privilege. The program we've assembled brings together leaders who are advancing practical, scalable approaches to resilient construction, community driven design, and forward looking infrastructure. We'll hear from state and national voices, from policy reforms to private sector models that illuminate how structural solutions can anchor stronger, more equitable communities across the country. Through collaboration, shared data, and human centered lenses, we can translate insights into action that reduces risk, protects families, and strengthens neighborhoods. We are fortunate to start this discussion with two of my colleagues who exemplify cross cutting real world thinking that this topic demands. Please join me in first welcoming Stuart Yasger of Economic Architecture. He will be followed by my colleague, Manon Donahue from Brookings. And they will introduce a panel outlining today's conversation. Following their remarks, we'll hear from our distinguished panelists, Lars Powell, Johanna Lawton, and Carlos Martin. As you reflect on the panels and its insights, I invite you to share your questions. Please send them to events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu, and we will incorporate them into the discussion. Thank you for being here, for your commitment to safer, healthier, and more resilient communities, and for approaching this work with both urgency and care. It is now my pleasure to pass the baton to Stuart Yasger of Economic Architecture.
Thank you, Andre. And hello, everyone. My name is Stuart Yasker. As Andre mentioned, I lead economic architecture. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We're glad you're here. This is the third event in a series of monthly talks presented by the Brookings Institution and Economic Architecture that focuses on creating safe, healthy, and resilient homes. Today, we're looking forward to a fascinating conversation about creating resilience in the face of hurricanes. For those of us who live in hurricane-prone areas, there are names like Ian and Ida, Sandy and Andrew, and Katrina that punctuate our years. Hearing those names can instantly bring us back to the day it happened. When we zoom out and we look at the cumulative impact of hurricanes over the last 25 years, it's massive. There have been thousands of lives lost, millions have been displaced, communities have been devastated, and we've incurred more than $1 trillion of direct damages. And unfortunately, hurricanes are going to become more powerful. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, warmer ocean waters are increasing the likelihood of major hurricanes. Over the last four decades, the chance that a hurricane will become a category 4 or 5 has increased by 25 to 30%. And this is likely to keep increasing. But while hurricanes will continue to get more powerful, Whether they get more dangerous in the long term depends on the actions we take. We need to ask, how do we reduce the risk that hurricanes pose to people, communities, and property? How do we become more resilient? The good news here is that there has been some really important progress. In response to some of these very same storms, communities began to innovate. After Katrina, Louisiana enacted its first mandatory statewide building code that improved homes to better withstand hurricane force winds and flooding. After Sandy in 2012, the city of Hoboken, New Jersey upgraded stormwater by creating green spaces that absorb water and by installing underground cisterns and pumps in parks. In Alabama, homes built or retrofitted to fortified standard reduced damage and insurance claims. Our panelists who are here with us today from the Alabama Resilience Council, Rebuild by Design, and Resources for the Future can speak to some of these developments directly and help us understand how far we've come. And one hope that I have for our conversation today is that we can gain a better understanding of where we need to go from here. With that, I'd like to invite Manon Donahue, fellow at the Brookings Institution, to join us and share a few opening remarks. Manon?
Thank you, Stuart. Hi, everybody. My name is Manon Donahue, and I'm a fellow at the Center for Community Uplifts at the Brookings Institution. I want to thank you all for tuning in today as we discuss this important topic together. Today, we're talking about resilience to hurricanes, which, due to the effects of climate change that are heating oceans in ways that supercharge storms, are an increasingly dangerous risk to communities across the US. In 2024, there were 18 named storms, including 11 hurricanes and 5 major hurricanes, Hurricanes Beryl, Helene, Kirk, Milton, and Raphael. Collectively, these storms directly caused the deaths of over 150 people. They displaced a record 46 million residents, and they caused over 130.4 billion in damages, making it the most destructive and the third costliest season on record. But there were some other astonishing records that were broken last year as well. Hurricane Beryl, which hit Texas on July 8th, was the earliest recorded hurricane to reach Category 5, gassed up by record high ocean temperatures in the Atlantic. Hurricane Helene, too, making landfall on September 26 as a Category 4, was the deadliest hurricane to hit the contiguous US since Katrina in 2005. The storm caused severe winds and flooding in areas that have generally been considered low risk. That includes communities like Asheville, North Carolina, where some estimates placed rates of home flood insurance pre-hurricane as low as 1%. It was, but is no longer, a region where residents thought they didn't need it. These changing risks, an earlier and a more widespread hurricane season, demonstrate the increasing pressure on communities from compounding risks. What do I mean by that? Some of the more disaster-prone regions have entered persistent cycles of disaster recovery and response as hurricanes intersect with other disasters, weather extremes, and other types of emergencies. Following Hurricane Beryl, for example, most of Texas experienced a prolonged heat wave, with close to 11 million Texans losing power for over a week. The heat wave that followed, rather than the hurricane itself, ended up leading to more hospitalizations and more deaths. Hurricane and disaster response, it's no longer such a simple game. Responding to this more dynamic set of risks requires a different approach that can enable the communities to break out of cycles of disaster response and recovery. Resilience, the ability to bounce back and recover from extreme events in ways that facilitate long-term adaptation and learning, and also the center of our discussion today, is a concept that leaders in regions across the US should be embracing to guide that different approach. Now, this year is a particularly important milestone for the study of disaster risk reduction and resilience. August 29th marked 20 years since Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast. The hurricane, it was a naturally occurring event, but its impacts were the result of a man-made disaster. A series of policy failures in response and recovery amplified the impact of the hurricane and flooding, resulting in deeply uneven outcomes along lines of race and wealth. A national tragedy the hurricane was also a turning point for our national disaster management system, elevating disaster management as a function of federal government. Now, New Orleans isn't the sole focus of our event today, but I want to stay with it just for a moment because studying New Orleans holds so many lessons for the structural innovations that could help drive resilience today. And over the last 6 months, our team at the Center for Community Uplift has been working with the Data Center, a Louisiana-based research not-for-profit, to answer a simple question, and that is, how resilient is New Orleans today? We found a more complicated answer. The metro area has made strides in some key respects, transforming governance structures, investing in flood adaptation, and diversifying the local economy. But there are still looming challenges, including persistently high rates of poverty and wealth inequality. Now, what was clear from our research is that New Orleans, like other cities, aren't going to be able to engineer their way out of risk alone. It will take structural changes across diverse sectors like housing, like jobs growth, like community safety, and other areas to drive resilience. Now, I highlight this finding to raise a question that I hope our panelists can shed some light on today, and that is, what opportunities could come from embracing resilience as a lens to guide municipal and state planning in regions across the US? Rather than framing climate adaptation as a tax on local development, how can it instead be an opportunity to build more resilient and thriving communities? Now, the reality is this: New Orleanians aren't alone in the risks they face. Miami, Charleston, Savannah, Houston, Virginia Beach, all these cities and many more face similar risks of hurricanes, storm surges, and sea level rise. These places, they should be national leaders in resilience planning, leaders in water management, and leaders in climate adaptation. So the question is this: what are the planning, policy, and development choices that could build on the experiences of cities like New Orleans to help prepare other regions for the changing risks that they face? Now I hand back to Stuart, who is our moderator, and who can introduce the panels and kick off the event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manon. Thank you for those kind of thoughtful comments and framing of the conversation today. Please, everyone, please join me in welcoming our panelists. I'll introduce them. I'm just about to turn to introduce them. But as some of you may know already, we had a last-minute change. Commissioner Fowler of the Alabama Department of Insurance is unfortunately unable to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. But I am delighted to say that we will be joined in his place by Dr. Lars Powell. Dr. Lars Powell is a director for the Center for Risk and Insurance Research at the University of Alabama. He is the center there identifies and solves risks and insurance problems with research and education. And Dr. Powell currently serves as the president of the American Risk and Insurance Association as well, and is on the boards of Smart Home America and the NAIC's Center for Insurance Policy and Research. Welcome, Lars.
Happy to be here.
We're also joined by Johanna Lawton, who is the Deputy Director of Rebuild by Design. And Johanna is driving resilient infrastructure initiatives at local, state, and national levels, as well as collaborative stakeholder engagements to develop community-centered climate adaptation solutions. Ms. Lawton's work focuses on equitable long-term planning and policy development for climate relocation and displacement, extreme heat adaptation, and flood mitigation, with an emphasis on multi-benefit, nature-forward infrastructure. It's good to have you with us, Johanna. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Carlos Martin, who is a Vice President for Research and Policy Engagement at Resources for the Future, the oldest think tank devoted to environmental energy and climate economics and policy. He's also a non-resident fellow, senior fellow, at the Brookings Institution, and has served on several National Academy of Science committees and advisory boards, including HUD, EPA, and FEMA, and the McKnight Foundation, to name a few. Welcome, Carlos.
Folks.
And just before we all begin, I will remind you once again that if you have questions for our panelists at any point during the webinar, you can email them to events@brookings.edu to share your questions with us, and we will get to as many of them as we can during this conversation. All right, let's dive in. So each of our panelists have been deeply involved in advancing resilience in very different ways, from the state level action to community-based design to national research and policy. We really wanted to start today by grounding us in the journey of resilience that brought each of you to this work. Johanna, can you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Stuart, and thank you to Brookings and Economic Architecture. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's such a timely moment to reflect on my story, Rebuild by Design story, to resilience, as we are currently coming up on the 13th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. As anyone who's listening if you were living, working, going to school in the northeastern region during Hurricane Sandy, you'll recall that it left a massive amount of devastation. Over 40 lives in New York City alone were lost, homes damaged and destroyed, hundreds of thousands without power. And it was a huge wake-up call for the region that not only do we have this tremendous physical risk to climate hazards, but there's also, it showed that it's going to exacerbate the underlying social vulnerabilities of our region, not much unlike what we heard from Manon with the experience of Hurricane Katrina. And so what it showed was that we could not build back exactly how it was done before, that there needed to be a moment of rethinking and rebuilding towards future impacts. And so the federal government, having learned from the experience of Hurricane Katrina, launched the Rebuild by Design Hurricane Sandy Design Competition, which sought to do exactly that, build forward. And it brought together international design teams, local researchers, state, local government, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, residents from neighborhoods that had been impacted by Sandy in a time-bound process to collaboratively research and design resilient infrastructure solutions. And it culminated in 7 incredible projects that are now in the region today and serving purposes for resilience and serving the communities they were designed with. And that gave birth to Rebuild by Design as an organization to carry out that mission of working collaboratively with communities to plan policies, programs, and projects that prepare us for the impacts of climate change. And I'll just note that I definitely feel in my work, I stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to this work. I was not at Rebuild by Design during the Hurricane Sandy design competition, but my fellow panelist, Carlos Martin here, actually was part of the process as an evaluator. And so we have this incredible expertise from the moment of that experience. And the work that we do today at Rebuild by Design definitely builds on that DNA baked into the process.
Yes, that is great, and no accident that we have the panel that we do today. Lars, I wonder, before we turn to Carlos, can you share? I know you also weren't on the Resilience Council at the time, but can you share the story of how Alabama went through a similar kind of trajectory in the response to this massive disaster?
Sure. So my first job in Alabama was to lead a research center that was going to help fix the insurance problem. And it's kind of a false problem, because insurance is where you feel pain from hurricanes. But if you look at the way our market behaved after Ivan, which did the most damage, and then Katrina was just shortly thereafter, both storms hit Alabama hard and destroyed a bunch of houses. And the insurance market did just what it should. It paid its claims, it reevaluated its risk. It invested in information and determined that it needed to charge more premium. And that premium is the thing that people notice. So we had some people much smarter than me with a lot of wisdom about this, who one of which is Commissioner Fowler, the other is our former commissioner, Jim Ridling. And they said, this is not an insurance problem. This is a problem with the economics of what happens after a storm. It seems like it's a very rare thing when you're in the middle of it, because, well, it didn't happen yesterday or the day before, it happened now. But we know it's going to happen over and over again. And we can't do anything about the cost of it, the cost of rebuilding, the cost of buying insurance afterwards, until we change the economics of what happens after a storm. And so they set out to find a solution to this. And what they found was the IBHS fortified system. And it started with some really basic blocking and tackling of, hey, we've got to get incentives in place for people to want to build fortified. We've got to get contractors trained in how to build fortified houses. We've got to get insurers educated on how this is going to affect their expected losses so they can charge premiums. And as that happened, and as more people learned and got on board, and we kept just stacking up these fortified designations one after another, it caught on. But along the way, that's what I call the kind of blocking and tackling. But as you alluded to, we created what's what we call the Alabama Resilience Council. And it was a brilliant idea that came up in conversation with a number of people, none of which was me. But when I heard about it, I thought it was very exciting. We actually did a bit of a road show. When you try to, I'll give you the basic, the broad sketch of it and where I think it's going to go in the future. But then for any of those, and I know we're with Brookings, so some people probably care a little bit about politics and government. And that was the real lever to pull to make this thing happen. So we reached out to, I think it was 12 or 15 kind of primary state agencies, and then another 20 or more agencies, both federal and state, that are more peripheral to resilience. But we said, we've got to be thinking about this the same way that, I don't want to say the same way that a business or a private firm does, but following more of an enterprise risk management system holistically, and you look for the best way to solve it instead of doing what government is really designed to do. We have all of these state agencies because you have to have different expertise, you have to have different resources. So we actually visited, we took a year and we visited the heads of all of these entities and other influential people to kind of socialize the idea of, what if we all get together and we're not trying to take anything from anyone? If anything, we want to share what is already there in ways that make it look really good and make it work really well. And the council has met maybe half a dozen times now, and every time they meet, there is another recognition of a way that they can work together to minimize risk. The very first day, the very first introductory meeting, the emergency management director, Jeff Smitherman, was saying that they needed to fix a water treatment plant that had been damaged by a hurricane, and they had money from FEMA that would cover about 40% of it, but they needed another, maybe $7 million. I might get this number wrong, but right across the table is the director of the environmental something agency. I apologize. I won't. I'll hear about this the next. But they said, "Oh, I've got that available. So if we each write a check, then we can fix that." And I think there's just a ton of opportunity for that in almost every state. I mean, I don't think Alabama is unique in anything more than, well, maybe college football, but the idea that, hey, let's work together and try to solve some of these problems that's not rocket science. That's just, hey, we need to have people that are willing to do the right thing. So every time that they get together, there's another recognition from forestry or Department of Environmental, and yeah, there's a lot of acronyms that I could tell you the acronym, but I don't remember what they stand for. So I'll just, that's part of being a professor is you know what you know and you know what you don't know. But I think that's a good introduction. I don't want to talk for too long because as a recovering professor, I will.
I think it's a great start. And it gives us, it's because, resilience, the need for resilience really cuts across all of these different silos. And we need to make that manifest in how we actually organize ourselves in government and different organizations. So it's a kind of wonderful example of that leading to action that wouldn't have otherwise happened. And Carlos, your research kind of spans so much of this. I mean, Johanna mentioned some direct experience with Rebuild by Design, but also it spans housing, disaster resilience, equity. I think one of the themes that's coming out here is that creating resilience is not just a technical fix. It really is. It's social, it's government, it's markets. It's also tied to community well-being and equity. And I wonder if you could help us start with a few comments there.
Sure. I mean, I should note that my training is as an architect and a civil engineer, so I don't want to downplay the intervention of a technical fix, right? There's a reason why material reality of how homes can protect us from the elements is an important part of this conversation, as well as the bigger infrastructure that can protect those homes. So let's not downplay that. But as somebody who studies housing, I can certainly say that the physical conditions of our homes they invariably mirror our social and economic disparities. And in most cases, they perpetuate them. So housing quality and location are a reflection of who we are. Let me talk a little bit about a couple of points I think that are important to add to build off of what Johanna and Lars have said. I mean, first off, it's important to note that exposure is not vulnerability. I mean, the likelihood and occurrence of a physical hazard event is separate from a household's ability to survive that event literally and financially, and their house's capacity to withstand and to be a durable home. So people's ability to have that durable home, to afford the appropriate insurance coverage, to pay the upfront costs for property mitigation, akin to Lars's point, and to be civically engaged or to have the political influence to shape the regional infrastructure, which RBD was able to overcome, are all critical reflections of our housing. I guess second point, the interplay of exposure and vulnerability plays out very differently in a different place and a different time, right? There are communities along the Gulf of Mexico in which whiter and wealthier households live in the coastal communities, right? Their houses are more exposed compared to rural riverine communities. So the social phenomenon of what's happening out in Miami is very different. It's almost the inverse of what's happening in a place like New Orleans. Just like the spatial histories and access by race and class differ in both of those places. I guess third point, to build resilience. I talk about housing all the time. Rebuild by Design was all about the regional infrastructure. Certainly the first Rebuild by Design interventions were around that. And we need to consider some of these interventions, right? And this includes financial interventions like insurance coverage. Let's start with the physical. I mean, the technical nature of regional, community level, neighborhood, and property scale interventions can work collectively to physically mitigate and to be conduits for that kind of risk sharing that Lars is talking about. Um, let's use some examples. In places like New Orleans, you have combining a levee or sea gate with community gardens, community level rain harvesting, and property level interventions. These can all work really well together, and with an appropriate exposure mix for our jurisdiction and to provide a multi-lever opportunity to be calibrated for each of those different jurisdictions. I always think about this in particular in the relationship to Rebuild by Design. The first question in Rebuild by Design had an extensive community engagement in forming the regional infrastructure, right? And the very first question, almost every public town hall that occurred throughout the New York region was, how does this affect my insurance? Right? How does this seawall, how does this levy, how does any of these interventions affect my individual property? And so really calibrating those appropriately, I think is really important. The sum of these parts can reduce the hard costs and certainly make the investment more affordable and more palatable. Last point I'm going to make. We haven't really done a good job. I've talked about the physical side. We haven't done a good job of investing in the social infrastructure, the social capital, social cohesion, however you want to call it. We know that social networks are critical for surviving a disaster. And I propose that social networks can also help mitigate and prepare a neighborhood before a disaster. And that's the kinds of civic engagement, the word of mouth, the peer pressure, mutual aid. There's so many opportunities there that can be as effective as a seawall and as insurance at helping us survive for the better. And RBD, like I said, had civic engagement in its DNA.
That's fantastic. It's a fantastic point. And I think it's one of the really interesting distinct differences in some of the conversations about wildfire from some of those in hurricane, because by its nature, many of the wildfire conversations really have a community orientation that is kind of newer in some of the hurricane conversations. I think it's been we're talking about some of these changes. I wonder, Johanna, can we start with you? Can you take us down into actually talking about some of what this innovation looks like and how has it been developing over time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think what's interesting and to look back a little bit, what was innovative about the Rebuild by Design competition and how that has spurred current and future innovation in the way we're thinking about design and recovery from these major disaster events. A few things stand out. One in particular is this idea of not putting back what was there before. Rebuild by Design marked a really critical moment in the disaster recovery space to say we're going to build forward, not just for, another event that might happen like this, but also take into consideration scientific and to the best of our knowledge, the projections for future climate impacts. And so that is a tremendous change to the way we think about not just compensating households or communities for the things that were lost. A second aspect that was really innovative at the time is not going in with solutions identified from the very beginning. In a traditional process of design, you might have an RFP for a seawall or some other critical infrastructure project, and you're kind of locked into that solution. And so what Rebuild by Design transformed is more of a design thinking approach of saying, what's the need first? And then together, as a collaboration, come up with the solutions. And that really expands the opportunity to engage communities in co-designing projects that will meet their needs every single day, as well as during a major storm. And that ultimately expands the solution space of the types of projects that we result in. So that's why the projects that came out of Rebuild by Design, and I use the Rebuild by Design competition and those projects a little bit as a conduit to talk about a lot of recent design thinking that's been transformative across the country, but these are the ones that I most concretely have exposure and experience with. But these projects then really have expanded the solution space so that we have resilient infrastructure in communities that serves, as Carlos was mentioning, some social needs, whether that's recreational space, creating opportunities for convening and building social resilience if you want to have a cookout space, a public gym, or a space you can use every single day when it's blue skies, and then also a critical infrastructure barrier during major storm events. And so what we're seeing are projects that may not have come out of the traditional handbook because communities informed exactly what they would need. And I think a really great example of that is in the Rebuild by Design project, the Big U, which is conceived as 10 miles of flood protection along the lower tip of Manhattan. And each section of it actually was informed by the adjacent neighborhood. So we talk about it as this collective project, but realistically, it's actually, I think, 7 total projects, each designed with the adjacent neighborhood, and each of those are informed by those needs of the community. Of course, as Carlos was mentioning, that absolutely raises questions of who has input and who has the capacity and who informs those needs. But I think in terms of setting a precedent to make sure that those conversations are even part or having that table is even being made was a really important part of this. And it's informed the way future projects and current projects today are getting planned.
And Lars, can you tell us a little bit? I don't think, you mentioned the beginning of it, but I don't think people realize as widely kind of what the fortified home program looks like in Alabama and kind of, and how does it work? What is that innovation that came out of those early days?
Sure. Well, there's 2 main parts, and the first is the engineering, which I'm not the best person to tell you that, but I can tell you. I mean, I've done this. We built a Habitat for Humanity house about 10 years ago, and I got up on the roof and nailed these things down and put the tape across the seams. But it's some very common sense things, using stronger connections where the wind is going to pull on the house, putting a secondary water barrier underneath the roof shingles, using a higher quality shingle, things like this. If you can keep the roof on the house and keep it watertight, then you minimize damage from a hurricane. You lose a few shingles, you can put a few shingles back on. If your whole house fills up with water, then you're looking at a huge remediation bill that is not just hard to pay for. You also have to vacate your home for a number of weeks or months until it can be fixed. And so that's all a bad thing. So in general, we found this scientifically based, engineering based standard of fortified homes that has different levels from bronze, silver, and gold. And today they've changed bronze to roof. So I think it's more descriptive and less pejorative of being bronze. But so that's as deep as I'll go with you today on the how fortified works, but how you put it in place is what we did really well in Alabama. It was not something that everyone wanted to do immediately. We were accused. I say we. I mean, I'm talking about the leaders in the state, and I was on the periphery of that and trying to help. But we were accused of blaming the victim for not having a strong enough house when a hurricane came through. And I look back on that and I think, well, that's exactly what somebody needs to do everywhere. But it wasn't, people weren't ready to hear it because they didn't have any proof that it worked. And other things have been tried that weren't, that didn't make folks happy. And it was a very sensitive subject. One of the things I've learned the most about in this whole process is people and ways to persuade, not that I'm this great persuader, but that there have to be incentives in place. You can't just say, hey, go do this thing because it makes sense. It has to make sense from everyone's perspective. So we had a grant program we call Strengthen Alabama Homes. To date, or the last time I got the numbers, which was a few weeks ago, they had done $93 million in grants, and that's about $10,000 per roof, a little less for some. So about 9,400 roofs have been retrofit. In some cases, these roofs were worn out, and in some cases they weren't. But what you have to do is change over the housing stock. And creating that grant program meant that you knew there would be supply because there's going to be money spent on it. So the contractors learn how to do it, and then once they've done one in the grant program, they'll try and sell it to someone else that's paying out of pocket or having insurance replace their roof. And so it really made it spread. We've done about 9,300, 9,400 grants, and we've got I think close to 57,000 fortified homes in Alabama right now. So creating, it's not just a build it and they will come, it's a build it and pay them and they will come. And also tell them what the discount's going to be on their insurance. And then when people get that discount, have them tell their neighbor, because it's amazing what people won't believe when you say, no, you'll get 50% off of the wind portion of your insurance, which is maybe 35 or 40% of your full insurance bill on the coast. Like, yeah, sure, I will. So yeah, there's a lot to that. And, but trying to just implement the process and have people do it was not easy. We had a few false starts, but now we've got folks that are, I think there's 29 states right now that have a strengthen trying to get funding.
Yeah, I think while it's already been going, started that many years ago, but it's still going on. And, in some ways we're still in the early days, but we've seen, that material changes to the building can make them safer in the face of these increasingly stronger and stronger hurricanes, as Carlos mentioned. Exposure is not necessarily vulnerability, but then we have to actually enable people to take this up. And the government has played a really interesting role here in actually starting to catalyze that. And now, over 50,000 homes that are stronger in Alabama than they were before is remarkable. And we're starting to see it spread to new states. And I think people are just starting to understand also the implications this can have on insurance and how that can help reinforce some of those incentives to get more people to do this, and raises the possibility, are we going to see a market-based approach here that can really help the scale from the tens of thousands to the larger numbers that really are needed here. Carlos, you sit at such a kind of a crossroads, or you have this kind of vantage point to be able to look at a range of these innovations. How do you start to characterize? How should we be thinking about that? Or can you help us wrap our head around some of the innovations we're seeing that are starting to address some of these things?
Sure. I mean, I should note, I don't want to be long-winded, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, because I think part of the challenge is that we don't think of innovation as much in the disaster space and in the resilience space. We have a history of focusing on resilience when the disaster strikes, and at that point, nobody's looking to innovate, right? This is true for our political rhetoric. The local politicians saying, we'll rebuild immediately, we'll rebuild better. And that kind of rhetoric is sort of limiting to being, and it's also in our our collective psychology, right? So that is very inhibiting for innovative practices. Most people will just want to get back to normalcy, even if normalcy sucked, right, before. So it's been my observation that we only innovate in the resilience space when there are sufficient resources, that is both financial and intellectual, when there's political will, and when there are either mandates or organized advocacy that overcome those forces. Otherwise, innovators get ignored. And if you want me to give examples, I think over the last decade, we saw a big movement, a groundswell among a lot of advocacy groups, including National Income Housing Coalition, Texas Housers, that have pushed for better data and reporting and transparency. And I think that's been a very impactful strategy because as an evaluator, it's that data that I rely on to be able to measure impact, to see if something's innovative, different from before. And so those federal processes have certainly improved as well. So I would say this work has been the most impactful in terms of changing policy and programs or innovating on policy and programs, if you want, if you will.
Great. And I think asking, I know time is going quickly and we have a lot of audience questions, so we'll move to there in a moment. But just before we do, I'm going to ask each of you maybe quickly go around the table if we can start to say, if we start to look at the horizon for a moment. So we've talked about kind of these large inflection points, change, a really growing change in how we're starting to think about this and what people are doing in different regions that are confronting the risk from hurricanes. Where should we be going? What's on the horizon? What does that horizon look like? And how do we start moving towards it? Johanna, can you share some thoughts?
Yeah. So I think part of it is just thinking about resilience in integrating it into every aspect of our planning and policies. Hoboken, New Jersey is a great example where they have implemented resilient stormwater parks that serve communities every single day and also store each at least 1 million gallons of stormwater. Talk about not capturing a story of innovation. When New York City was underwater during Hurricane Ophelia, Hoboken was dry by 3 p.m. the next day, and camera crews were turning around because there was no story about flooding. And that's the problem. The story is that we don't see the flooding. And so what I think is also particularly amazing there is that Hoboken integrated the stormwater approach into everything. Part of their green infrastructure is also combating or participating in their goal of zero pedestrian deaths from traffic. And so when we start thinking about this as an opportunity to transform communities for the better in every aspect of our transportation planning, our housing planning, and our social services, then we have an opportunity. And I'll just say one thing that I think really is an important opportunity is addressing extreme heat. While we're talking about storms and hurricanes, I think addressing how we're adapting and innovating on the design of extreme heat is something we need to look to critically on the horizon.
Absolutely. And I know time's going quickly. Lars, a couple quick thoughts on the horizon?
Sure. As quickly as I can, mitigation needs to be the norm and not a challenge or an investment. We don't really have a choice. We can't insure this. And you can't just rebuild everything every few years and expect your insurance to not be really, really expensive. It needs to be the norm and not an investment. There needs to be innovation in the way we fund and finance these projects. I think we're really on the cusp of that, but we're not quite there yet. And there's a lot of other things that can help around the edges, and we need to do all of it because it's not, like I said, insurance markets are doing exactly what they can and should. This is really an infrastructure and an engineering problem as much as anything.
And Carlos?
Sure. I think the sum of the interventions and of the inputs, the enablers, the resources and champions and political will are making certain communities viable, and only certain communities can afford and have the ability to be able to bring these resources to bear in their communities. And so the real question is whether every source of state and federal funding is going to make these communities viable. I mean, recall that we have a lot of places that are in harm's way, but continue to get Department of Transportation money, education money for the schools, right? Instead of thinking about whether there's a better place or amenable relocation programs, et cetera. So this is important. But at the midst of why we're all arguing that we need to better align all of these funding streams, we're actually finding that the one agency at the federal level that has been leading this is being dismantled. So we haven't talked about the elephant in the room, and that's with federal funding and coordinated support that is being dismantled as we're speaking. And so this is having real consequences. And so I'm looking forward to the audience Q&A to explore this.
Well, I think that's a great kind of jumping off point, and the Q&A coming from the audience actually is prompt. And I will remind everybody, you're welcome to submit questions. Please, events@brookings.edu if you have any questions. There are a number of questions that have already come in, and we'll try and incorporate them here. The first two questions actually kind of prompt us to think differently, to broaden the scope actually of also who's affected. So one question is, and I'll raise them both at the same time and kind of pick them up as you have kind of areas to contribute to them. The first one is, how are we preparing workforce for natural disasters? And I imagine both workforce that's being impacted by these disasters and that is needed in response to this. So that's one way of kind of broadening who we're talking about. And the second, which comes from North Carolina, which is saying, we often think of it on the coast, hurricanes affecting the coast, but with more hurricanes coming inland, how are we starting to prepare and build resilient homes and infrastructure in places like the mountains in North Carolina, where we saw such a devastating impact?
I can take the first one if somebody wants to take the second one. At least on the work. Yeah, all right.
Go for it.
All right, the workforce side, certainly the occupations that are most associated both with mitigation and with rebuilding after these events happen are the building trades, right? These are both from heavy infrastructure through actual building, home remodelers, et cetera. And as somebody who has studied that workforce for quite some time, I know that we're having some real challenges with supplying the appropriate skill level and the appropriate quantity of workers in these spaces. So a lot of it is expanding current apprenticeship programs, current community college training programs around the broader construction workforce. We also have a major challenge with immigration, changes in immigration policy that are keeping a lot of those trades from being filled in, particularly after extreme events that often require very quick turnaround on workforce. Where there's the Resilience Force, the organization that actually tracks how immigrants are moving around the country after disasters. Has been a tremendous advocacy group and organizing group, but also shining a critical light on the fact that this is a major source of our workforce in these events, and to make sure that those people have stable jobs, appropriate protections and salaries, as well as the skill levels is going to be an ongoing struggle in this country.
I have
And
a
I'll
slightly
just add to
different
that.
take.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. Well, very quickly, the slightly different take on that is it's an opportunity. It's a resource. There are a lot of employers who have to be located at the coast. We've got companies in Alabama that build ships for the Navy, and so you can't. You got ports that can't do that anywhere else. And I know that a lot of these places lose millions of dollars every day that they're closed. So if your employees, if your workforce doesn't live in a resilient structure, if they don't have a place to live, they're not coming to work. They're at home making sure their family has water and can find some shade to sit in after a storm. And this is something that we haven't found a good way to draw a straight line from the large employers who are at the coast near the ports to, hey, this is something you can invest in with a positive return on investment, and also strengthen your community and your workforce.
And I'll just add to that, one of the common challenges that I hear from municipalities is funding maintenance. For a lot of places that want to invest in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, often finding that expense funding is the biggest barrier to being able to invest in a larger workforce. And so I do think we need a broader conversation about some of the innovative funding models, as well as best practices and more sharing across municipalities and states who have started to figure it out.
And for the inland places that are having, especially in Hurricane Helene, we saw a lot of inland wind damage. My parents had wind damage at their house in Greenville, South Carolina. It's about a 4-hour drive from the coast because 4 trees fell. It rained for a full day and a half, and there was a 30-mile-an-hour wind. And this was also a big thing in our study of Hurricane Sally, that 46% of the claims were from trees falling on houses. And some people don't like to hear this. Now, I'm not saying that trees are bad. I'm saying a tree that's tall enough and close enough to your house to fall on it and is not healthy is a problem. So you've got 2 issues inland, primarily flooding and these wind damage claims, and those are mostly from trees falling on houses. It's a paradigm shift. when you see a pine tree start to grow up 30 feet from your house, you can be sure that 30 years from now, it's going to be tall enough to fall on your house and do a lot of damage. The thing to do is run over it with your lawnmower. Now, the ones that are 60, 70 feet from your house, they're going to create a good windbreak for you. But we just need to think about these things on the front end because it's really expensive to move them around once you've already got a 100-foot pine tree in your yard.
That's, I think one of these thoughts of, in this space is as we start to look at those things that we see as assets, but also realize the risks that they can create. I don't know whether the lawnmower is the right prescription or not, but it is.
So, well, okay. Whatever tool you like, just tell your children to go pull it out, something.
The next question to kind of move us forward is we were asked, the construction of weather-resistant housing is a good initiative, but it also highlights the importance of climate change all over the globe. Do you think the U.S. should lead the serious efforts in controlling carbon emissions and get to the root of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that we're continually chasing a problem that we're making bigger as we're simultaneously trying to figure out and consistently innovate. So adaptation and resilience is so critical because we have surpassed thresholds that are already causing unforeseen, severe, volatile conditions that are impacting communities. And that in particular has serious implications, particularly for low-income communities, communities of color, and we're seeing that across the country. But at the same time, we're making the challenge bigger and broader and more unpredictable. And so we absolutely need leadership to make sure that we are directly addressing the emissions crisis and no longer aggravating climate impacts to the extent that we have been. So yes, I would agree that we do need strong leadership from the US and among countries around the world.
I would just add, I mean, if you just look at the housing sector, American housing produces the same greenhouse gas emissions, the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions as the country of Germany, right? These are major contributors to climate change, and climate change effects are what we're trying to address. I'm really grateful that Johanna brought up one of the effects being heat and not one of these sort of water-based acute events that we often are the more likely to respond to. But heat waves require more people to be indoors in air conditioning. More air conditioning requires more energy. More energy often requires more fossil fuel use, which means more greenhouse gas emissions. So it becomes a cycle. So there's a real reason why these are simultaneous efforts that we can embark on. We can chew and walk gum at the same time as a country.
Chew and walk gum.
My walk and chew gum, that's the phrase. I apparently can't.
So what kind of support do households need to act on these kind of resilience plans?
Depends on the household.
Well, yeah.
But certainly money is number one.
Yeah, I think there's certainly money for your lower income thresholds. At the higher income levels, what you really need is to be jealous of your neighbor who has a fortified home and has some way to demonstrate that their house is therefore better than yours. Because we know that's what motivates a lot of people in the higher income categories. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think we can agree that it's true. Moreover, the most valuable thing that a lot of the lower income folks have is a job. And we did a study after Hurricane Harvey in Houston and showed that some of the worst things that happen to folks you can't buy insurance for if we interviewed businesses and some of them mowed the grass or sprayed for bugs or cleaned these vacation homes at the coast. And when no one's using them or when they're destroyed and being worked on, everybody's job goes away. So even having the more affluent areas, any way you can encourage them, and if you don't have to spend as much money to make them retrofit whatever, when those houses are still standing after the storm, there's still a job to go to for folks, and that's something that I think's been overlooked. Not that it's more important than mitigating those houses. We've done some of that in Alabama too, but it's a harder nut to crack than you would think. And we've been told to get off somebody's porch when we're trying to give them a $10,000 roof because they don't believe me. And I'm not sure that I blame them. Maybe I just don't look trustworthy, or maybe I don't look like that. Whatever it is, it's really hard to implement these programs at a lower income level unless it's multifamily housing.
And I think that having, tax incentives, regulations, all of the carrots and sticks are critical for individual households. But again, I'll just emphasize the need for community-wide infrastructure that can be undertaken by government and led by government. And when government does take on these initiatives, the importance of having interesting, fun, and supportive engagement processes that actually meet people where they are at. Whether you do something from a food trucks festival to a cook-off, go to people and get their input and meet them where communities are already gathering and use that to inform the design of community infrastructure that will reduce risks to individual households without putting families through the need of extensive construction and retrofitting.
Great. And last question, I think, and try and do this one quickly, even though this is a big question that the whole session could be on, is what is the role of the current administration specific to FEMA and the disproportionate effect it may have on red states more than blue even?
I have a little bit different take on that, that having applied for a number of FEMA grants and never gotten any of them, I know I'm thinking more of research and infrastructure grants we participated on. I'm not certain that reshaping FEMA is going to make it harder to get money as long as the money comes from somewhere. Just trying to put a little bit of a silver lining there. I know that things will be more expensive if FEMA is not, if no one's providing the resources that FEMA used to provide. But maybe it'll be more efficient.
I think the bigger challenge that we're facing with it's more reduced federal coordination and potentially reduced federal funding. I mean, certainly federal funding helps, and it certainly helps those places that are lower capacity. And so I would say a lot of the places that are going to be most affected are those that don't have the resources on their own, both to run their own projects, and the state and local governments have actually been a large source of infrastructure funding of the kinds that we're talking about for quite some time. It's not FEMA exclusive funding by any stretch on most of these projects, or Army Corps, we should add. But they're losing major intellectual capacity. And so that's going to be the bigger issue, I'd say.
And I'll add that we've emphasized already the importance of being proactive as it is reducing risk and suffering. And also for the economic argument, it saves dollars in the long run. I believe it's the U.S. Chambers of Commerce that just put out every dollar invested in risk reduction resilience saves up to $34 in loss and damages. And so the administration does play a role in creating those incentives and that proactive investment in reducing risk. The BRIC program, which was run through FEMA, which the first Trump administration introduced, and it just recently actually was rolled back, was one of those programs that does offer proactive investments in large-scale community infrastructure. And so programs like these are ones that we should uphold and applaud as things that can help us reduce our risk ahead of the next storm, and also save money. It saves so many tax dollars in the long run when we take these steps to invest ahead of the storm.
Well, that's great. That's going to have to be the final word, and kind of what an apt final word, I think, for this conversation. I want to thank you all, Johanna, Lars, Carlos. Thank you for taking the time, sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences, and helping to frame this conversation. Thank you, everyone who's joined us for this third event in the series of monthly talks that's hosted by the Brookings Institution and the Economic Architecture, which is focusing on creating safe, healthy, and resilient homes. We hope to see you at our next event in October, when we'll look at the ways that the insurance industry impacts resilience and rebounding from extreme weather-related events. We'll look at structural innovations already in play and look towards the horizon together for this important piece of the puzzle. Also, every week we are hosting a series of one-on-one conversations with innovators in a new podcast that's at Economic Architecture Project. That's Economic Architecture Project/podcast. It's also available on all the podcast platforms. And we missed him today, but we will be speaking with Commissioner Fowler in the near future. So please do join us for that conversation. We hope you tune in. And with that, I'd like to pass the mic back to Manon, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Stuart. I've got the job of closing us out. I just want to start by thanking you all for watching this important conversation. And a special thank you again to our panelists, Lars, Johanna, Carlos, and of course, our moderator, Stuart. Now, I'm going to keep this brief, but I want to close out with just a few remarks. In the session today, we've been discussing resilience and the types of structural innovations that are necessary to build community-level resilience. Now, this is an incredibly important topic, and it's not to be underestimated, as communities across the US face down increasingly unpredictable and dangerous climate risks and weather extremes. Yet, Johanna just mentioned that at the last minute, federal government policy is removing access to resilience grants. The axing of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's flagship BRIC program, that is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, is the most recent example of this. Now, since 2020, that program had allocated more than $1 billion annually to help communities break the cycle of disaster recovery and response. That funding, typically seeing wide bipartisan support, was a lifeline, hardening infrastructure to threats like hurricanes and reducing long-term disaster impacts on families. This and changes to other federal programs is part of the reason that structural innovations like those that we've talked about today are so important. Innovations from the private sector, from insurance firms, from local planning departments, and public-private partnerships. Resilience planning is too important to become a political wedge. It's a goal worthy of broad, bipartisan appeal. It is, and increasingly so, just smart policy that can help keep families safe, keep families out of debt, and keep families economically mobile. Irrespective of the language that we use, climate disasters and weather extremes are here to stay. Adapting to them by building resilience ought to be a society-wide endeavor backed by federal and state policy that fosters bold and creative solutions. And we're going to keep talking about it. So this is the third event, as Stuart mentioned, in our Safe, Healthy, and Resilient Home series, and it won't be the last. We will continue talking about resilience and the types of bold structural innovations that can move us forward. So please follow Brookings and Economic Architecture for updates on upcoming events. And again, I want to thank you all. Thank you all to our panelists, and good afternoon.